So there's been some interesting rumor mongering recently about an upcoming PlayStation handheld machine. We understand there is one in development. However, details, specifications haven't been forthcoming. However, again, noted leaker Kepler L2, who came up with extremely accurate specifications for the PlayStation 5 professional APU, has been spilling the tea, so to speak, on the technical makeup of Sony's in-development handheld. And, well, it's certainly interesting, right, Oliver?
Yes, yes. So basically, the specs that Kepler has laid out here, he's basically laid out that it has 16 gigabytes of RAM, apparently LPDDR5X RAM, 9600 on a 128-bit bus. So just for reference, that would give it 50% more bandwidth than a Switch 2 potentially there. But it's only a 128-bit bus. A lot of people were expecting a wider interface. It has a 16 CU GPU, apparently, presumably from, the AMD's next graphics architecture family, presumably UDNA there. It has 16 megabytes of MALL cache, memory access last level, which is kind of conceptually similar to Infinity Cache. I know that Strix Halo has, I think, 32 megabytes of MALL cache. So that is helpful, presumably, for helping to deal with that bandwidth deficit, because it does have a big bandwidth deficit relative to the PlayStation 5, relative to other extant current generation consoles. But yeah, it is interesting there's no LPDDR6. I kind of assumed that would be in the package just because of the rumored launch date for LPDDR6 products. But in terms of the specs relative to a PS5, because this is kind of mooted potentially as a portable PS5 system, you're looking at about 1/3 the memory bandwidth and some fraction of the GPU shading power. Just for reference, that configuration in terms of the CU count and actually the ROP count would be just exactly half that of the 9060 XT. And we have no visibility in the CPU, but presumably, of course, RT would be a lot more efficient than the PlayStation 5 design per CU. It would have good ML acceleration, presumably for next generation PSSR and next generation PSSR technologies, right, from Sony there. And presuming UDNA is at least as efficient per CU as RDNA 4, those CUs should be somewhat more efficient than the CUs contained in the PlayStation 5. And it would be servicing, of course, a lower res screen. I'd presume maybe a 1080p panel, not a 4K display. That's another really critical difference. On paper, a lot of the specs look quite similar to Strix Point, but the better architecture will presumably make a big difference. We're still looking at a 16 CU design. We're still looking at a 128-bit memory interface without LPDDR6. There are some points of commonality there. Maybe it's also going to be an 8-core CPU just for simplicity there as well. But I think critically, it's a console piece of hardware. It'll have the hardware decompression block, presumably. It will have games that are specifically made for that hardware. And yeah, I mean, the hardware on the surface doesn't look crazy impressive or anything, but in the context of a console platform where people are making games for it, in the context of FSR4 potentially being in the mix, in the context of other machine learning technologies being in the mix, in the context of maybe even having a lot of shared architectural elements with the upcoming PlayStation 6. I think it could be a really compelling platform.
I think the big question mark from my perspective is what is the new AMD architecture and to what extent is it better than the ones that we've got already? That's the big unknown. And the extent to which that architecture may be far more efficient in dealing with bandwidth deficits, because the bandwidth thing is what's holding back APUs on AMD handhelds quite significantly. That's really interesting. I mean, the whole UDNA thing, I mean, I'm expecting to see an actual sort of shift in the way games are being rendered next generation. Not so much heavy on GPU, more balanced with machine learning based features like, well, let's be honest, upscaling and frame generation. I think that's all part of the mix. So, the extent to which it's comparable with existing handhelds, that's debatable. We just don't really know what AMD have got cooking there. But, again, you think about what Microsoft is talking about for 10th gen console, biggest technical leap from any console generation. It's not coming from GPUs. It's coming from machine learning features. I think we can take that as read. And that will translate into whatever this handheld's doing. So I'm quite excited about this. I would also really like to see, and I think we've talked about it before on the Direct, full hardware back compat with the PlayStation 4 library. That might actually make a 1080p screen quite interesting, because otherwise I really think they should be going for 720p for any sort of handheld screen. I mean, I don't know what you think, John, but Switch 2, I don't really see any real advantage from. I guess the screen is bigger, but I'd have been happy with 720p.
Yeah, I tend to agree, specifically in terms of screen stuff. And actually, there's a lot more to talk about the Switch 2 screen that goes beyond resolution that we'll get to soon. It's not a great screen. I will say that at that size, upscaling lower resolutions to 1080, it's not as aggressively bad as I might have expected. It's kind of okay in a lot of cases, but I think the issue, I guess, facing anyone in this space is like display availability as well. Like, if depending on the size they want to target and the specs they want, if they want VRR and all that, like maybe that type of OLED panel isn't currently being made, for instance, which could be a limitation. But I don't know. I'd actually be fine enough with 720p target, as we've seen from plenty of other devices at this point, that when you're at that size, 720p looks good. And it saves a ton on pixel cost for the GPU, which starts to make the concept of this potentially more doable. Like, again, we don't know enough about what this is going to be to say, but I could envision a platform that somehow essentially it's like it's like the inverse of what the PS5 Pro is, where developers also target this handheld with their games. But the problem there, I guess, is like, I don't see how you could run non-patched games from PlayStation 5 on a portable hardware like this either. So
they'll be patched. There's no doubt about it.
But like all of them?
Well, not all of them, but it will be an imperative to expand the reach of existing games, right? But it is kind of ironic that, if these specs are to be taken at face value, and let's say we don't know what UDNA is actually doing, it is almost like Sony's releasing a PlayStation 6, and then there's kind of like a Series S style PS5 also being made at the same time.
Right.
But I do think UDNA is going to have a lot to say in terms of the feature set, at least. Interesting stuff. But we've also got this news, Oliver, that Xbox seemingly has not just sidelined its own first-party handheld, but actively just cancelled it at this point. So I'm curious what you make of that.
It's been reportedly cancelled, or at least put on hold. I know that last week or the week before, there was some news that potentially the handheld was put on ice for some period, but this seems a little bit more definitive. But I mean, ultimately, I don't think the concept of a portable Microsoft-made Xbox handheld makes sense if it's just another Windows device like the ROG Ally X. The Xbox ROG Xbox Ally X, or ROG Xbox Ally, sorry for messing that up. Clearly they aren't waiting for their own device to ship, and Asus will do a great job with manufacturing and design as well, because they have, such a great lineage of PC handhelds at this point. They're very good at the hardware. And Microsoft seems to have been involved in that hardware design process as well. So it does seem to be like a Microsoft co-designed product. If Microsoft did want to make a proper quote-unquote Xbox handheld with a full Xbox OS and a platform, an Xbox platform, Xbox game support, I think there is value in that. But in this form, would there really be value in that for Microsoft? I'm not so sure. But if this is the route Microsoft wants to go, then I do think it makes sense. As long as it's just a Windows box running Windows software with this level of accommodation in the customized version of Windows that they are using, I think that probably could be good. Again, I'd like to see a lot of movement for Microsoft in that front to get it like more close to parity with SteamOS. But as long as Microsoft is going down this route, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to focus on OEM hardware that's not from them, because there are a lot of people competing in the PC handheld space, and a lot of them are making very compelling devices at the moment, and Microsoft isn't one of them. So I suppose going with one of those companies makes a lot of sense.
What do you make of an Xbox handheld there, John?
Man, what do you make of anything Xbox right now, right? Like, they're in such a strange transitional phase. I really just don't even know at this point. And if they're really moving towards this sort of like full Windows focused console design spec, I mean, they're clearly working with partners already, right? And the Asus stuff is just the beginning of this, I'd say. So it kind of, I can kind of see why Microsoft would be looking at getting out of basically the hardware business, so to speak, right? Not completely, but working more directly with partners instead. Because ultimately, I mean, their business, Xbox has become a publishing arm more than anything, like the biggest publisher in the world, perhaps, if not one, so it's all about just getting their games wherever they can get their games. And Xbox is just part of that rather than the focus. And, when looking at all that, when thinking about where they are in the market, I feel like that doesn't make sense anymore for them to spend too much time on their own bespoke hardware in the same way that they used to, the subsidized platforms, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, they do have a 10th generation console coming. They have confirmed that.
Sure. Sure.
But beyond that, I mean, the question is what's going to happen for 11th gen or whatever, if there is even an 11th gen. And the other question, I've been thinking a lot about in the wake of the Final Fantasy 16 thing that happened last week, where they just released an Xbox version out of nowhere. What happens with the next generation there? Because if the next generation Xbox is effectively a Windows PC, how can a deal be made with Sony for exclusivity without freezing out the entire PC platform? It can't really be done. I don't see.
Yep.
I mean, what would Sony do? Stop Square Enix putting it on the Xbox store? Well, people would just get it from the Steam store. There's no point. There's no point actually having any kind of limitations there whatsoever. So I'm very curious how that's all going to pan out. And, also in terms of the competitive landscape, I've still got this theory that Final Fantasy 16 is a PC port, which may explain some of the suboptimal things that Oliver pointed out. I mean, somebody pointed out to me that I don't know whether this is true, Oliver, that the cutscenes stutter in the same way that they do on PC. I'm not sure which again maybe have pointed to a PC port there. I don't know, but ultimately, how are you going to distribute this thing? Are you just going to freeze it out from the Xbox marketplace? What does that solve if they can just buy it somewhere else?
I think there are probably some ways to figure out whether it's descended from the PC port fairly easily, because some of the cutscenes that are real time on PS5 got pre-rendered for PC. So presumably if those changes are carried over to the Xbox version, I imagine you could figure that out. And if I had a little bit of time, a little bit busy at the moment, perhaps I could figure that out. But yeah, there are some ways to figure that out.